Okay, so now for why you all came here, a bit of background information on our esteemed expert. Payal is a leadership mindset coach for highly driven women leaders who often struggle with imposter syndrome, perfectionism, and the guilt of setting boundaries. Totally relate to that. She has coached hundreds of executives at Fortune 500 companies, including Sony Music and Betterment, and has developed a global leadership programs for organizations such as McDonald's, Southern California Edison's, and US Foods. No big deal or anything. As a PhD candidate in organizational psychology, Payal has researched the role of empathy and psychological safety in creating transparent and accountable workplaces. Based on her findings and years of experience coaching hundreds of executives, she has formulated her 3-pillar leadership framework: empathy for others, compassion for self, and accountability for both. Ultimately, Payal has a goal to inspire audience members to change how they see themselves and their innate gifts and recognize their power to make a positive impact in the world. So on that note, I will hand it over to you, Payal. We are so excited to learn from your expertise today. We know how valuable your time is, and we're so grateful for you taking the time to speak with us today.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for that introduction, Hannah. I'm so excited to talk to all of you today. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for spending your hour with me as well. Today, I really think this is an important topic that especially a lot of women are feeling challenged with, and that is how to have difficult conversations, whether it's a performance conversation, whether it's a conversation with a peer, miscommunication and feedback, all of that, and how it can really create anxiety within us, but we can still handle it with a lot of empathy. So I'll be going over that today. And, how many of you have put off, having a difficult conversation because you don't want to hurt the other person, and you keep justifying that it's not necessary, like, oh, we can have that in a month from now. It's okay. Let me just see how they're doing. And what that does is that because of that feeling and the idea of having a difficult conversation makes us feeling tense and creates anxiety, we'd rather keep the peace. And we think that, like, let's just keep the peace and that way, it's okay. But the thing is, and what's so powerful is that we all miss out on by having these conversations is that we miss out on knowing how to actually overcome those difficult moments that can actually strengthen our relationships. See, the thing is that we try to keep the peace, but what happens is that because we're not actually communicating and we're not sharing, we're actually building up and brewing more resentment, and we're building up more animosity and avoidance, where that ultimately it can actually make the relationship break that could have been prevented by a conversation. So I like to reframe the reason of having that conversation. So the other piece of why it's so important is that, a lot of times when we think about an employee that we may have, or someone that, is working for us, whether it's a contractor, even if it's a vendor, to be honest, but in this situation, if it's a employee, if there are things that we haven't necessarily been able to talk to them and we've continued to avoid that, what we're missing out on is that individual learning that one issue that they could have fixed is not, and then it's costing us clients, it's costing us potential revenue, it's costing us our peace of mind. And because this is our business, it's our baby, right? And so because of that, we feel even more protective over it. But the idea of having that conversation is so the anxiety is so palpable that we may have to end up letting someone go who actually may be showing a lot of potential, but we haven't had those conversations, so they don't even recognize where they went wrong. Now, the other piece is that when we give an effective performance feedback, what can happen is that those crucial conversations, if we don't have them and then we just let somebody know, like, hey, this isn't working and we need to part ways, what happens is that it comes with a lot of shock. You may burn a bridge and the reputation may even be severed. What also happens is that when we don't have those performance conversations, when we don't have just even feedback one-on-one conversations and really address the things that are problematic, then, and we continue to maybe show it in our behavior or actions, that individual could also potentially leave and ruin the reputation of the company because, or of the leader, because as we know, people leave leaders, they don't necessarily leave the company. And so when we think about that, it's really important that in order to sustain that reputation, in order to really recognize, how we want to show up, what's the culture of our environment? Do we want to have a place where people can feel safe to share what they're feeling like and how to grow and what their challenges are? It's really important to have those conversations that may be otherwise challenging. So, I always say, I'm interested in their success. So it's important to have a conversation to help them grow. Oops, that was a misspell right there. But, one of the things I mentioned about that is that it's the reframe that we need to have. When we reframe the fact that, this conversation's too hard, I need to avoid this, what happens is that it produces this emotional reaction within us that creates those justifications of why not to. But when we reframe that in our minds to saying, I want to help this person grow, I'm interested in their development, that changes the purpose of having that conversation. So this is everything we'll go over today. And, Hannah already gave such an incredible introduction. So don't necessarily need to go into it, but I just want to reiterate that this is my passion. This is my love. For me, it's as a woman owner myself, it's been really critical to support other women to really see themselves and hold the power of their narrative of how they show up and to really see themselves as the CEO of their companies. Because as a mindset coach, what we can know is that we can learn strategies, we can learn technical issues, we can learn tools, everything. But if we don't have the mindset to address something, then none of that matters. And I'm sure that all of us have had coaches and mentors, and it's really our own mindset that really makes a difference in the way that we show up for ourselves and our company. So, all my work in my PhD and I was a former clinical therapist prior to leadership development work. So I've bridged all this together and brought it together in order to support women to really feel that they have the full power and authority of how they want to show up for their work. So I'm going to get right into it so that we maximize our time. Um, so today we'll really be exploring how to raise your awareness of the physiological and the psychological response to anxiety. Because this is really important to discuss because one of the reasons about having a difficult conversation is that you can read articles on it, you can read books about it, you can watch TED Talks on it. But when it comes to the actual moment, how do you actually know to raise and to recognize the awareness of what's happening within your body so that you're able to calm it down, you're able to relax it so that you're able to go into that conversation with a little bit of peace of mind? Because it doesn't matter, it's always going to be tough, and we recognize that it's never easy to have those conversations. But when we can raise our awareness even throughout the conversation of how we're handling it, then we're able to have a little bit more clarity around the way we speak up. Next is how we reframe the way that we internalize the way we communicate with others. And I'll be teaching a 3-step approach to difficult conversations with empathy and assertiveness, and how to set expectations at the end of the difficult conversation, which is a really critical piece because a lot of times we're so consumed with having the conversation, we forget how to close the conversation. So that is really important to also address. So the first thing and the first topic that I'll go over is the physiological and psychological response. And just so you know, guys, I will stop. I know I'm talking a little fast right now. I'm just trying to catch up to our time. But I will have moments here where if you have questions, please put it in the chat feature. And, I will definitely be stopping to see and respond to everyone with their questions. So first of all, I wanted to talk about our body's response. The thing is that our nervous system, think of it like your internal thermostat. It regulates what's happening within us to ensure that we stay safe and secure. And so one of the most essential things is thriving and is survival. So our nervous system has 2 branches. And it's, we talk about it as the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for our activation function. So this is where our body, turns on and uses energy. And so when we are in a perceived like threat or in a stressful situation, this is when the sympathetic response activates, and it activates our flight or fight reaction. So what is flight or flight? Fight or flight, I'm sure you've heard of it, but it really was a survival tactic in order to help us when there's issues or there's anything that of alert. So think of it like a security system going off in your brain and alerts going off and saying to you like, hey, you're in danger. So what happens is that, of course, back in the day, that was because, we might have had an animal that was chasing us to eat us. Obviously, that's not the problem today. But today, when we have our mindset perceived to say that a difficult conversation is something alarming to us, what happens is that our body starts responding with a racing heartbeat, with irritability. Tension builds up in the body. So when tension builds up in your body, what happens is that your body is now in a state of freeze, and it's not allowing itself to breathe and to be able to go into this conversation with clarity. We're so consumed at that moment with our own thoughts about just being anxious that we're not actually in the conversation. We're not able to be present. And so that's where our thoughts are going a million miles an hour. When we think about, when you're in a conversation and someone is speaking to you, but you're not really hearing them because you're surrounded and consumed with your own thoughts, that is where, you're having this response and this reaction. So it's really important to keep note of how your body is responding. The parasympathetic nervous system, that is responsible for the restorative. So this is where it's, again, when threats or stressful situations happens, this is where the individual is trying to like avoid conflict, right? So you may shut down, zone out. Someone is speaking to you, you don't really like what they're saying, but you feel the urge to just say, okay, sure, because you just don't want to have that conversation anymore. You prioritize other people's feelings, and so your feelings take a back seat. And what happens is that once you have left that situation, there is this emotional response of, gosh, like I don't feel any better having had that conversation. And so now it repeats and validates that there's no point to having these conversations. So I wanted to bring this to the awareness because you know when we are in the situation and you start noticing your body, you start noticing that your heart is beating faster, or you start noticing that I'm not actually listening to the other person, I'm just so consumed. You can take a deep breath and remind yourself, even say it to yourself like, it's okay, I'm in a safe environment, I'm okay. Like actually saying it to yourself out loud allows your brain to process it. It sends the message to your body, and it actually like allows you to relax that emotion, relax that body, physical movement that's happening within you. So this is really one of the essential ingredients to having like a healthy and engaging conversation is when we feel safe in that environment, and when we can really tap into the place where we feel like we know what's happening in our body, and we can actually like put a name to it, put a language to it. So, as I was mentioning, many of our fears manifest in the fight or flight and response, which is, this evolutionary makeup of us. And so what happens is that, when we exhibit more of the fight responses, they become, where we're raising our voices, we're engaging in verbal attacks, or, demonstrate some behaviors that mean overcoming that perceived threat. So an example of this is when someone is speaking and we attack their position, or we attack their statement because in the intent to hurt that other person, or we argue over the person without acknowledging or validating their perspective on things. We use like unflattering labels to describe the other person, and this is coming from a state because we are trying to protect ourselves. So a lot of this happens in those when we're stepping into a conversation, especially it's when it's with someone that there's already been some tension that's been brewing, or there's been an avoidance of that, and now it's come to a place where there's got to be some really hard topics. So oops, it didn't. Oh, is it? There we go. Okay. um so sorry, it was taking a little bit on my end. Okay, so with that, conversations that our approach to conversations that we have is truly a mirror to ourselves. And it can be really hard to hear and send us directly into this like defensive and protective mode. Because the thing is that our egos are placed to support and protect us from negative information. So our egos only want to hear positive and make sure we're in a good place. And we need our egos to protect us. However, if we lead with our ego, then we struggle with receiving anything. So there is this misconception that having an ego is a bad thing. And especially when it comes to women, right? That, oh, that person has a lot of ego. The thing is that having an ego and being centered with your heart is actually really, really important. And the reason for that, as I mentioned, is that the whole reason that your ego exists is because it's there to protect us. So when we go into these difficult conversations and we go into these challenging, we're about to receive feedback from someone, we're about to give feedback to somebody, immediately our ego is there. Think of it like the bouncer at the club. And so it's just like that. It's your bouncer and anything that may be coming in. So if someone is responding to you, your ego is immediately up there saying, no, 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 unless it's any information that I accept as a positive, I'm not going to listen to it. What happens with that is it actually becomes also the nemesis of growth. So when we learn to recognize that, it's okay to have an ego because we need that in order to protect us, but we also recognize that, when we're about to go into a conversation and we're about to listen to someone, we can tell ourselves, hey, you know what? I need to hear this. I need to be present for this. And it's okay for me to receive this information. When we can allow ourselves to say that, then it actually shifts the way where it lets your ego take a back seat and allows you to center yourself with the heart and let you think about things from a place where it lets you take responsibility for your behavior as well and having a more open and vulnerable conversation. So part of being a business owner is facing, some of these conversations that you're having with vendors, with clients, with, your support team. And one of the areas that I talk about or I think about is really, really critical is looking at it as a woman. A woman that is able to share her vulnerability, share her thoughts, and to really reframe that as being an admirable thing because the way that our social conditioning has been done is that for us to be assertive and for us to speak up, it means that we are being difficult, we're being challenging. And so how do we shift that? And the way to shift that is to really recognize how much of our ego is actually being in place to create defensiveness for us and how much of this is coming from a place where it's not creating an honest space. So the better we communicate with each other, even in the difficult conversations, the stronger the bonds we can actually create. And we don't leave any room for those guessing games. And I bring this up because, when we communicate and how we speak to ourselves is directly related to how we operate in our business, how we treat our employees, how we, the words that we actually use. All of those make a difference. So it's not just about going into the conversation and saying, hey, you know what, you're not doing great work. It's the way that we're also sharing this information and then having the space and time to know that when we talk to someone, it's not easy for them either to hear this. So, how can we really be present and recognize that they may have a response? And it's okay for them to have a response because they need to process what it is that I am sharing with them. So I'm going to stop for here for a split second and just see if anyone has any questions. Okay. If you do, go ahead and add in the chat feature, or we'll definitely have time at the end as well. So, one of the important things and what I wanted to address here is so then what do you do? How do you prepare yourself to go into that conversation? What can you do for yourself? One of the first things is to check in with your body. As I mentioned before, we are, in this place of, whether it's our heart beating, whether it's our thoughts going, whether we become frozen. And it's giving yourself time prior to the conversation. Maybe it's the night before even, and you're actually visualizing that conversation. You're preparing for it. And pay attention to your body. Pay attention to what is going on, how your response already is. If you're feeling yourself already getting really heated and the conversation's tomorrow and you're already feeling that, ask yourself, what is getting me so upset? What is it about this that is really, creating this kind of a response? Am I ready to have this conversation, or is it still where my emotional regulation is not, standardized? So, if one of the things that you really want to do is, as you are visualizing and preparing for the conversation, you want to really tap into your body at all times and recognize that when I'm feeling a racing heartbeat, that means that I'm feeling anxious, and give it a name so that you're able to release it. What that does is that when you're in the conversation, you're now so in tune with why your body is responding the way it is. Maybe it's someone says something and suddenly your hands become a fist, or you start playing with your hands a little bit. Recognize that, okay, I'm feeling anxious. I recognize that. So what is it that's happening, and pay attention to that. In order to accept the response, what you want to do here is that, as I mentioned, is that once you pay attention to your body, but also as you're communicating with the other person, you know, accept and recognize that they are going to have a response. That when they have a response, it is going to bring up other things in my body. It's going to bring up other, thoughts for myself, and how am I, responding to this. So being present is really important, not just for the conversation, but also because 80% of our, communication happens with our body. So if we are not being aware of how we are responding and how we are connected to ourselves, the other person is going to see a disjointment between our words and our facial expressions. So if we are saying something like, you know what, I totally understand that that you were struggling for the last couple of weeks because you didn't have the right information, but my body language is where I've got like my hands folded, or I'm rolling my eyes. It feels disjointed. And what happens is that it sends a wrong message to the other person. So when we are aware of the fact, like, okay, I just rolled my eyes here, I need to address this. And I can say, hey, you know what? I think that there's something that you mentioned that I don't agree with, then let's talk about it. That way, it's our language and our body is connected to each other. And that's really important. One, for yourself to be in control of it. And second, so that as the person is talking, they're really seeing you as authentic, and being vulnerable with that. And you want to be able to refocus your mind. So when it comes to a moment where things are just going really spiraling in your head and you're not able to focus, being able to say out loud even that, you know what, I think that we need to take a I need to recap this for a minute, and I want to just write a few things down for myself so I can refocus on this conversation. That's okay to say. Allowing yourself to actually take your mind and tell it needs to get centered. Acknowledging your body's movement. What that means is that, sometimes when we're having these kind of conversations, well, a lot of times we have them right now. Of course, it's a Zoom chat, or it may be virtual if we're not in person, or it's in a meeting room. What we're doing here is that our mind is being so active because there's so much tension, or let's just say that it's not even like a necessarily a tense conversation, but it's just some news that you have to deliver that you're not, it's not someone would want to receive. What happens is that our minds are still being so active, but our bodies are still. So what that does is our bodies aren't having the processing of our emotions. They're having to sit still. And so it creates even more tension brewing up within ourselves internally. So one of the things that you can try to do is a walk and talk, or do something where you get up and you maybe go for a walk with the individual. If you are in a virtual setting, then maybe it is still like you take the phone and you're able to do a phone conversation versus a Zoom conversation. Maybe just go for a walk within the meeting room, whatever it may be. But you want to do something where your body's movement has a ability to process the emotion that's going through so that it releases some of that tension. Take a break. This is a very simple one. When things are getting escalated or things are feeling a little cluttered and it just feels like we're not actually getting to the result that we want, it's okay to say, hey, you know what? Let's take a coffee break. I'm going to go grab a coffee. Do you want to do the same thing? Or I'm going to take a bathroom break. Or, let me just grab a snack. Why don't you do that too? Take a break so that you can collect your thoughts. Give it a 5 minutes in the middle. This helps you to really take everything, process it, regroup yourself, and able to show up again in a way that is beneficial for them and beneficial for you in the conversation. So I want to stop here again for a moment and ask if there's any more questions. Okay. So, you know, topic two that I want to go over is how to reframe how we communicate. This is a really important piece about having these difficult conversations. And, as we're going to get to, and I'm going to go over the 3 steps of having that difficult conversation, the reason I'm bringing all of these pieces up is because this is a really critical part to the way that we're thinking, the way that we actually are thinking about the conversation, the way that we are connected to other people. A lot of it has to do with the way that our social construct is and the social bias towards women. What has happened is that, because there's this um, notion about women and the stereotype of women to be agreeable and likable, there's a lot of guilt that we take on. And we take on other people's emotion because as empaths, we look for someone else's emotions. We have been, there's a characterization of like really protecting other people, being the caretaker, being the nurturer. If you look at our commercials, our advertisements, all along, the time, it's that has what has really been feeding into our society. And so when women are assertive and we speak up, it's, you know, a lot of times the conversation is that only when a woman needs to speak up, then she does. And that is where, we may think that, of course, like for example, myself, like a very assertive person. And what happens is that internally there's this conflict that's going on of, am I being too aggressive? But we have taken the word aggressive when a woman is actually speaking up for herself. And so the conflict that happens there is that when we actually say what we really want, there's so much of this emotional response that, well, by me speaking up, I hurt somebody else, or I am now putting myself before them. And what happens is in our brains, we start to think that we are being selfish when that's not the case at all. It's that we are actually being open and healthy, but we've created this societal conditioning of believing that, when women speak up, it's being, you're meant to sacrifice yourself. You're supposed to be selfish. It's selfish to speak up. So, you know, um, as long as when when we think about all of these pieces that are moving within a woman, right? It's that one also from a more social cognitive space, we want to be liked. It's actually part of our DNA that as humans, we want to be liked. We want to be part of a community. And so as women, again, we're nurtured to be liked. And so from a very early age, women are urged to be pleasant, engaging. And so conversations that involve confronting others, pointing out negatives or setting limits or saying no are difficult because they challenge everything that we've been taught to do as nice girls. And as strange as it may seem, adult women buy into those overgeneralized and simplistic childhood lessons about empathy and social grace. And the imperative to be likable and to not upset or discomfort others is one of the most common reasons that adult women hold back from having those conversations. So, how do we change that? The way that it's perceptive, it's our perspective, right? One of the things is that our brains, and if we think about situations, certain scenarios that we're in, the scenario is actually a neutral scenario. The reason that there is an opinion about it is because it's the perspective that we add to it. What that means is that because of us being a product of our environment, because of how we have processed everything from a social standpoint, from a bias standpoint, from when we look at the unconscious bias and we look at where we are and our personal experiences as well, that is what then creates this perspective about what it means to have that conversation. And that conversation then is that as a woman, it may seem that, well, I'm just not confrontational. I just don't like to have those, And what it does is it actually shames the idea of being able to speak up. And what it does is it just says that, where you're hearing is that it's just not worth it and water under the bridge. I'm much more of a peacekeeper. I don't need to bring things up. And what all this does is this shaming is that, it brings up this point that my voice doesn't matter. That if my voice matters, then I'm just being difficult. And it's the language and the core belief that we have surrounded ourselves with that have made us to feel that us having a voice is selfish and that us having a voice is means that we're being very demanding. And even those words that I'm using, right? Where did we hear those words? Who decided that that is the words that we are going to associate ourselves with? So when we immediately use the word confrontation, it means you've told your mind to be prepared for a fight, to be prepared for an argument, that your mind actually sends this message to your body and your body responds with folded arms, a reserved tone of voice, all of those physiological responses that I talked about earlier. And your body posture becomes stiff. And then in response, that body tells your mind that you are not open to a discussion, to hearing perspective. So now you're ready for a fight. And the further validates that I don't like having confrontations. This is literally what happens as a cycle in our body. And that is why it's really important to even reframe that thinking. Because when we reframe it to conversation, then we're able to say, hey, you know what? I'm just having a conversation with someone who I think is really important and is an integral part. And in order to have this conversation, I want to help them grow. I need to learn and get perspective. And now all of those barriers come down. And that's why the word choice is so critical in the way that you mentally prepare yourself for conversations. So, what do you focus on when you have that difficult conversation? When once you're in it, right? Now we're in the conversation. The one thing is that you want to do is you want to focus on behavior. Sometimes when we go into it, we immediately start characterizing the actual person or thinking about, well, they're like this and they're like this, and they're being difficult. Instead, focus on what was the situation. Hey, you know what? I've noticed and I've made an observation in the last few weeks, you've been coming in late. And the meetings have been running, a little bit later than normal. Is everything okay? By starting with focusing on the behavior and the circumstance of the situation, or saying that, hey, you know what, when we were with that client, I noticed that there wasn't an organization to the deck, that it wasn't well prepared. Did you have time for it? How is your bandwidth? What you're doing here is that you're focusing on the behavior, and you're not saying necessarily to them that you're being late, you're not organized, you're not this. What happens is when we remove the word you is a word that can immediately send someone into a defense mechanism, because now they're having to defend themselves and justify themselves. When we focus on the situation and we use leading questions with, tell me what's going on, is everything okay, what's on your plate, let's talk about this. What you're doing is you're opening the door to a conversation, and you're actually getting more information out of them. So then you're able to be better prepared with whatever points that you have prepared for that conversation. You now either are getting validated for it, or you're able to recognize, okay, now I'm understanding more about them. You're getting context out of them. What happens with that is any assumptions, any miscommunications get completely flattened out, which is really important. That person also feels very empowered, because they feel that, when they're going into that conversation and they're also equally nervous, that you're actually wanting to hear them. You're wanting to know their perspective. And it's not about leaning into their perspective, it's about their perspective is giving you context. And the third piece is acknowledging. acknowledging that, hey, you know what, I know this isn't easy, and I know that, there's been some difficult moments here, so I recognize that, and I've been in that situation in the past too, so I want to acknowledge that. By acknowledging what's going on, it actually releases that emotional stress as well. So I see Laura says, I'm okay, great. Thanks, Laura, for joining. Um, so the other piece is what not to do. So getting defensive when someone is actually responding and saying something to you, the emotional response of saying like, "Well, I don't agree with this," or like, I don't think that what you're saying is right. That is the response happening because again, it's that fight or flight, it's that reactiveness. But when we can hear that person and actually say, "Okay, tell me more." Tell me what you mean by this. What it does is it allows you to relax and it allows you to hear again the other person, releasing that judgment that may be coming in. Again, being aware of the way that you're responding. Like I mentioned, using you and avoiding using you and avoiding using why. When why is similar to you. When we ask the question, well, why did you do that? The person is sent into again a place of like, oh my gosh, now I have to answer to this as justify. Instead, if we use words such as, well, how did that happen? What was your thought process? Walk me through this. So, using words like how and what, there is a place for why, but to start with why is where you send the person into a defense place. By starting with how and what, it allows that conversation to open. And then later you can say, well, explain to me why that was important for you. That can happen at the end. However, in the beginning, you want to start with hows and whats. So now I'm going to just go over the three-step approach to difficult conversations. So I'm going to skip that real quick, but one is knowing your why. When you're going into any conversation, whether it's a performance, a feedback, one-on-one, you want to know what is your why. Why am I having this conversation? Why do I care about this? Why is it so important to have it now versus a month from now? Knowing your why gives you the clarity that when you're in the conversation, you're actually going to be able to continue to come back to that why and be very clear. So when we talked about refocusing your brain, it's refocusing it with thinking about your why. This is actually a worksheet, an activity that I take some of my clients through. And I'm actually happy to share this with you guys afterwards as well and just give it to you guys to have as a resource for you. But when you're in a conversation, one of the most important things is take an emotional temperature check. So this is where you recognize, how am I feeling going into this meeting? Where is my emotional balance currently? And I recognize that currently I am feeling distraught. So this means when I attend this meeting, I will be more, X, Y, and Z. So what it does is that when you're having that moment, you're able to recognize and tap into where I'm at right now. So, here are my examples. I recognize that currently I am stressed with deadlines, and this can help me in this meeting be more mindful that my stress levels may impact the other individual. I will stay cognizant of my stress levels and recognize that I might not be able to make the decisions in the moment. So even then sharing that with the person saying, hey, you know what? I know we're in this conversation. I've got a lot of deadlines happening. So I'm a little stressed out right now. So I want to have this conversation and I'm here present with it. However, we may have to come to our solution in a different meeting. And so letting the other person even know, so that way when you're responding, they're also aware of like what just happened 3 hours leading up to this meeting. Um, and they're aware of it as well. One of the things that I mentioned also is that there's three types of empathy that exists. And these three types of empathy that exist are specifically, to really think about as women again. And if you're highly empathic, this is really important to know because when we're in those conversations, it's very easy for us to just tap right into, the other person's emotion and completely forget our own. So recognizing that there's cognitive empathy, which is being, when you're intellectually understanding empathy. So this is where you're able to understand that someone else is upset, but you're not taking on their emotions. Emotional empathy is when you're actually experiencing the emotions alongside the other person. So the other person's feeling really upset, maybe they're getting teary eyed. So now suddenly you're getting teary eyed, you're getting upset, you're taking on the other person's emotions. The third is compassionate. Compassionate is where we intellectually understand what they're going through. We are, feeling the emotions and we spring into action to help. This is the one where it's great when you're wanting to donate, volunteer, when you're wanting to do all of those things. However, when you're in a difficult conversation or you're having a conversation that may be a bit challenging, you want to be mindful of your empathy level, because that is going to either, if you lean into compassionate, it may actually um, separate you from, what the purpose of this conversation was, and it may manipulate you a little bit to lean into someone else, and then you leaving feeling like, well, I didn't actually get my point across here. You want to remind yourself, like, okay, I'm starting to lean into this. I need to lean back and recognize that for a conversation like this, it's important to distinguish the separation and the difference between their emotion and my emotion, and recognizing that I understand that this is really difficult for you. I understand this has been really challenging for you. By saying that out loud, you're actually distinguishing the difference between that this is their emotion and it's not mine. So things that you can consider about is like pausing and taking a minute to, when emotions are rising, saying, can we take a moment to discuss what just happened here? You said a couple of things that I think we need to address before moving on. Or when the emotion is rising, then saying, your comment a minute ago is leaving me confused and wondering how to respond to this. I think we need to talk about it a little bit more. When it's them speaking about something that you're feeling a little harsh about, it's saying that, that comment seems to be a little harsh. I don't see how it's helping the situation. So having, key words and key sentences that are going to help you, one, release that emotional state for yourself, and then also carry them over. So that one thing is recognizing your emotional state. Positive intent, going into a conversation again with knowing that it's a conversation, not a confrontation. And with that, it's going into it knowing that the reason this conversation is happening is because it's actually costing us money. It's actually costing us, the other team members, a little bit of stress. It's creating more anxiety. It's creating the culture to turn a little toxic. So the positive intent here is that I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. This really matters to me. When we say that, it really makes a difference of knowing the why and going into it with that positive intent. When we distinguish, as I was mentioning earlier, when we distinguish the difference between our emotion and their emotion. So, what emotion is this individual experiencing? Are you able to recognize that that's their sadness, their frustration? And what kind of empathy is coming up for me? And what is the impact of that that's happening? And recognizing that this is there. So, as I was mentioning earlier, I recognize that you're feeling this way. By using that, it really, really shifts the way that your brain is actually able to acknowledge and separate it so that you're not now acting out of their emotion. So, we must recognize that the other person is also having a little bit of a challenging time, because those aren't easy for them as well. So the empathy that comes in is recognizing that piece that, I know that this is really challenging, or I know this is really difficult. Setting healthy boundaries. This is really, really critical, because as we're getting into these conversations, we want to acknowledge their vulnerability as well. So when they're speaking up, saying, thank you for sharing what's going on, so I know how to better support you. Thank you for sharing and trusting with me your situation. I appreciate you being so candid. And what I mean by this is that when we're in the middle of the conversation, the way to start a challenging conversation is to go in there, acknowledge that, hey, today I wanted to talk to you because I noticed and that's where you state the behavior. I noticed this coming up quite a bit. And I'm really curious what's going on, what's happening, in the situation with you, or, is there something going on that I don't know about? And then when they're able to share, you acknowledge their vulnerability, because that's not easy for them to say either. And the second piece is then reframe and validate, right? So you want to actually let them know, like, you know what, thank you for sharing that with me. I've actually been in that situation before, and so I understand. Or from what you expressed, I understand, and then go into something that happened where you can relate to them. Reframe that, use active listening to pull out the key emotions and the reframe back to them, because that's what's going to help them also release their emotion, be like, wow, okay, she's not here necessarily to reprimand me in a negative way. She's here to support me. And even though it may be something where I may be getting reprimanded, it's about now I understand why it's happening versus the fact that I'm going to personalize it and think that I'm a bad person. Because what we want to do is that we want to separate the person from feeling that there's something wrong with them necessarily, versus there's some things that are going on that is not happening well. And so then the third piece is asking for clarification. If there's something that you still don't understand, ask. Is there anything else you'd like to share with me, so that when I'm making this decision, I have that in mind? What else would you like to share that could help in figuring out the solution? One of the things that you want to keep in mind is that by having them actively part of the conversation is also empowering for them, because then they're able to be in it with you and they're taking an active role versus that solution decision coming onto them. So after, you've had the meat of the conversation where you've really acknowledged their vulnerability, you've reframed it, and you've asked for clarifications, it's setting expectations. And when you're setting expectations as an empath or as someone who wants to fix things immediately, you may immediately go into an impulsive or immediate response. And what happens with that is that, you want to think to yourself, well, okay, I had this conversation with them. I understand where they are, but do I actually, how is this going to impact the rest of the team? How is this going to impact my decisions for my new product line? How is this going to impact, our client work? What is that? And so to give yourself time and to make sure that you again create that boundary between you and the emotional guilt of having that conversation, you can have that conversation with saying to them, thank you, and I'm going to take all this information back and I'm going to think about it, and the decision won't be immediate, but I will get back to you. And let them know, give them some context. I will get back to you within the next couple of days. I will get back to you. Why don't we set up some time on the calendar for a week from now, so that we can talk about this, and I'll have some time to think of something. Recognize, like, how critical is this? Does this need to actually be a decision that is made within 24 hours? Then have that prepared prior to even going into that conversation. After that, what you want to do is, oops, um, okay, there we go. After that, what you want to do is take action steps, right? So you have distinguished your emotional bias from the actual problem, come up with a few solutions and the impact of the solution. Here are some questions that I have put together of, like, the ways that you can think through how to have that, solution, and bring them part of it. Ask them, if you were to solve this, what would be your ideal solution to this? Or what do you think would be an important part? How do you see yourself shifting in this? What would make it easier for you, or like to overcome this battle? What have you done in the past? By bringing them into it again, it will feel like they are a part of that conversation. Getting feedback, this is also really important, is that once you have left the conversation, and whether it's, again, you're working in a your company has gone to a point where you have HR involved, or you want to, it's a maybe it's a conversation where you have a lawyer involved with it, then you want to get their feedback. If it's not, then that's fine. But maybe there's a mentor that you can talk to, or maybe there's another, your COO that you can speak to and ask them, this is the situation, this is the conversation, these are some solutions that I came up with, what are your thoughts? By having that in mind, what you're able to do is, one, validate how you feel about it, and then two, have someone else that you really truly trust to be able to give you that feedback before you meet with them again. Then you take action. The piece about taking action is that based off of the feedback and the solutions that you're getting, you want to already for yourself determine 2 to 3 solutions or options that you are actually comfortable with. So, what you do then is that when you are ready to talk to that person again and provide those offers, it doesn't matter which one they take because you're okay with all of them. So, you don't want to ever put something on the table that you're not actually feeling comfortable with. So, by sharing this and sharing the transparency of the process of how you came to those decisions for each one of those, will help the other person have the context of why that offer or solution has been put on the table. And then that individual will be able to then say, you know what, I'm okay with moving forward with decision number one or decision number two. And you agree on the plan and you set future steps in order to make a plan, being like, you know what, I'm so glad that we had this conversation. I really want to support you. I want to see you grow. However, we need to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And in order to do that, as part of our solution, I'd like to like for us to meet more often than not. So maybe we're do bi-weekly meetings instead of weekly meetings. And we're going to, have this plan in place, and let's revisit this plan in maybe a month or 3 months or 2 months to see how things are going and calibrating. And then if we need to readjust it, we can. What this does is it sets the expectation. You still have a commitment. However, as things are flowing, you're able to go back and readjust anything that's needed to happen. So I know we're getting close on time, but these are some of the oh, and my battery's dying. These are some of the ways that we, oops, sorry. This is how, when we're thinking about a difficult conversation and how to have it without guilt and how to have it in a way that is really, in an empathetic way, it's taking the other person into context. It's really making sure that, you really pay attention to your own emotional self. You're able to pay attention to the way that you're showing up. You have a plan in place. And when you're talking to them, you're really avoiding the yous and the whys, and you're focusing on the I's, the behavior, the observations, and bringing them into the conversation with a lot of questions. So with that, I wanted to also offer, that if any of you have any more questions around this or have any more thoughts, I am here to support. And so if you want to have just a free 30 minutes, I can, in a specific situation that you're going through, I'm happy to connect with you and talk to you guys. So with that, I am done, and thank you.
Thank you so much. This was like jam-packed with so much tactical things we can implement. It's kind of mind-blowing to me. My mind was blown several times. And
Oh,
I love what you said about empowering your mindset and maybe doing things in a way that is actually like makes a lot of sense, but we've been conditioned to think, no, you shouldn't do it that way, because a lot of this makes so much sense, but I'm like, why have I never thought of it that way before? So thank you for kind of empowering us to really take control of the conversations we're having. There's like so much to unpack here, and I'm so grateful to have this in my tool set now. Yeah, if anyone has
absolutely.
any questions, you can drop them in the chat, or of course, book that extra time with Payal that she so generously offered up. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, here's my information. Absolutely, yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to provide that resource with those steps, and it's a PDF already. I can send that over, and for all of you to have it. But thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining today and showing up and just supporting each other. And we're so grateful for you. I'm going to do one more drop of the joining circle, and we'll hopefully see you in circle very soon. And we'll definitely see you at a future event coming up. And thank you so much again, Payal, for your time and for investing in the collective.
Of course. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Hannah, for giving me this time to talk to everybody.
This was fantastic. I hope everyone has an amazing day.
Bye.
Bye.